Witajcie w Smart City Navigators, podcaście o innowacjach, zrównoważonym rozwoju i najnowszych technologiach.
Ten podcast tworzy dla Was Navi Parking.
Kalina Tyrkiel is a content designer by trade, psychologist by training, UX writing trainer, and lecturer at the major universities, such as University of Science and Technology in Krakow and Tichenor European University. Currently working at DocPlanner. Let's welcome Kalina Tyrkiel in today's episode of Smart City Navigators podcast.
Hello, Kalina.
Hello, happy to be back.
How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm also very good, and I was just thinking about this this picture in the frame behind you. What's the story of that?
All right, so I think it might be pretty hard to translate into English, but I try. So it's a poster with 3 birds, and the bird's name in Polish is Kawka, which can be translated like let's small coffee, and it says like odmiany kawek, which is like types of coffees, and you have the big one, the small one, and espresso. There's like a tiny one on top, and you can see this one quite frequently in different coffee shops across Poland because like this, some language-based joke, and yeah, pretty much that's the story. I'm a coffee person, as you can tell.
Nice. Okay. Kalina, on the previous episode, we've been diving deep into UX writing. Today's episode is a little bit different, and we're going to speak about accessibility in design. So let's jump into this to this subject, and let's start with a very, very basic definition of what is accessibility in design.
All right, so maybe just to give everyone a better idea of how we can look at accessibility, people often think that accessibility, making design accessible, making products accessible, is about a very small group of people who are hard of hearing, people who blind people, also people who with limited mobility and so on. And that is true to some extent that we design products that are accessible to these groups with these disabilities, but there is much more to that. Apart from permanent disabilities, we also have temporary and situational disabilities. Pretty classic example like a broken arm or something that limits your mobility. It's a classic example of a temporary disability. And I think I use this example quite a lot, like when you have conjunctivitis, like some sort of inflammation in your eye. It happened to me recently, and just like looking at light is painful and interacting with visual stuff is quite hard. So this is a very classic kind of like temporary disability. You can also have like situational disabilities, which like it can be even related to your mental state, your well-being. Like if you're dealing with loss when you're mourning, you're also like kind of like cognitively limited. You're not like that as dynamic, as motivated as you would normally be. So this can also be considered a kind of disability. And to put other examples, like people on public transport just holding with their like one hand and using the phone with one hand is a kind of temporary disability, and it happens like quite often. Actually, as I really like to look at people using mobile devices on public transport, I think it's like an excellent kind of accessibility exercise, because when we test products, we tend to assume that people will use them in a very sterile, like highly ergonomical environments, with their full attention, both hands and so on. And the reality is often different. So that's can be also considered as a sort of disability, like something we need to take into account when designing accessible products. I would also say like things like direct sunlight and contrast, that could also be like a temporary thing that affects how we interact with products. And the bottom line is that accessibility is not designing for like a very small group of people with disabilities, but for everyone who will like sooner or later be affected by some sort of temporary disability. That's the main idea.
Is it very common practice in most of the businesses or designing websites or software?
Well, I'm happy to say it's more common. actually also because of legal requirements. In Poland, we have a legal requirement in place, I think, since 2020. It's actually like a European Union regulation, and it requires all public websites, and also from 2021 also mobile apps, to be accessible to a certain extent. And when we talk about accessibility, sooner or later we're going to get into the topic of WCAG. WCAG, it can be pronounced differently, but it's the abbreviation stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and it's an organization that creates and shares all these good practices when it comes to accessibility in design. So the current requirements for European Union is that all public websites need to meet the WCAG AA standard. You have 3 levels. You have A, you have AA, and AAA. And the AA is like AA is usually used in legal requirements, which means like you need to meet a certain number of criteria. And I mean, I know it can all sound like pretty abstract, but this criteria can refer to different things. It can refer to writing, which is like what I do professionally. It's about like the writing needs to be plain enough. Things need to be written in plain language in order to be understood by a large group of people. It can also refer to contrast, about like the text contrast on websites, and it's still quite a common sight that you have websites that are like they have nice color palettes and things, but the contrast is not really there. It's pretty hard to read. So the general rule is that the ratio needs to be 4.5 to 1, to like body text normally. But this is like numbers, like this can be found on the internet. So you have contrast, you have text, there's plenty of things related to code, to how the page needs to be structured, and there are certain elements that are required. And you cannot really see them, like if you are using the website like I am normally, or as you are, if you are just like interacting with the website like most people usually do, you don't see at first sight all those like accessibility things. But the thing is that it's not something that has been added a couple of years ago. It's been around in browsers, on websites since the beginning of the internet, really. So yes, there's plenty of things kind of under the surface to think about.
Can you give us some, let's say, a real-life example of how accessibility is directly implemented in maybe some website or app?
Right, so I think a classic example is an element called alt text, alternative text, and this is the written description of what's in an image, in a photo of different kinds of images. And it's read by screen readers, and maybe this is the time to talk about screen readers more, because it's a recurring subject when we're talking about accessibility. So a screen reader is a way to interact with a website, usually, or with an app, with like software, with like tech products in general, and it's usually used by people who by blind people who like very like limited sight, or it's not just, sometimes also people with limited mobility who cannot use a keyboard choose to interact with the internet with a screen reader. And it's pretty easy to enable. If you're using a MacBook, you can use Command F5 to enable VoiceOver, and then you can use Tab to navigate through the page. And it's a nice little exercise to see how it works in action. And one side note: if you see a blind person using VoiceOver, using a screen reader, most of the time it will be super fast because they want to navigate, through pages very rapidly. So it's going to read super, super fast, like much faster than you will probably use it. And it's only natural, like we navigate through pages, through mobile apps quite rapidly. And if you are used to it, you just have something that reads incredibly fast. And one story like from my own experience, I used to go to a massage parlor where blind people worked. They still do, and they were interacting with the phones via screen reader, and there is no way you can check the hour in a discreet manner. So I knew every time the person who was massaging me was checking the hour, and this is something you don't really think about unless you experience it. And it's so interesting like the best way to learn about accessibility really is to see people using these accessibility tools. Coming back to the alternative text, because it was very much of a detail, the alternative text is supposed to tell what's in the image. And of course, you don't need to describe like every single detail. Sometimes you have very specific, very complex images. And to decide what needs to be written in the alt text part, it's best to use something alt text decision tree. It can be found on the internet. You can Google it. And if you don't know if the image even should have some sort of alternative text or what should be written in there, it's a great tool to help you decide. And I think this is also a classic example. When you have a picture of a lake, should you say if the lake, like, should you describe the color of the lake? And it really depends on the context. When you have an article about like Plitvice lakes in Croatia, it's probably best to write something like this is like an image of Plitvice lakes in Croatia. And if the color is like super special, you may want to describe it. If you have like a pink lake, there are some of them, you can choose to write, hey, it's a pink lake. But alt text also needs to be quite brief. So you only describe the information that matters in the context. It's just in order for the person who's using a screen reader to get the same information they would get by looking at the picture. And that is also important in the context of the experience.
So you talk about, you're talking about graphics right now. And what about video?
With video, the very important thing that's often omitted, but I think more and more people are aware of it, is the subtitles. And it's not only about people who are hard of hearing or deaf. It's about people who just can't turn who just can't listen at the moment. Like people who have kids and they don't want to wake them up. People who are on the public transport without headphones, or if you have someone else in the room sleeping and you don't want to wake them up. There are like plenty of cases when you just can't enable the sound, and subtitles are a total must. And this is an accessibility requirement, but I can think of so many cases that are not related to disabilities, but people just cannot listen. And I think subtitles are the number one thing when it comes to video.
When we speak about video, right, is it possible with this technology maybe to use AI or some sort of artificial intelligence to try to describe video like on the fly, on the spot?
I think YouTube is using something like this when they generate subtitles automatically. And I think a good example to see what these subtitles might look like is when you have English subtitles on Netflix, for example, or or different streaming platforms. You usually get English with closed captions, and you have all this sounds described in brackets. And this is a good example of an accessibility practice, really.
Let's talk about how companies supposed to design their products in terms of accessibility for people with disabilities.
Well, I think first and foremost, it should be one product that takes different aspects of accessibility into account. And honestly, creating different versions of the same websites. One is more, let's say, screen reader friendly. It just adds unnecessary maintenance costs, and it's not really a good approach in the long run. I would say that taking accessibility good practices into account just improves the design in general. If you design something that's accessible to many different groups, it will be a better product in overall. So I would say digging deeper into WCAG recommendations, reading more about good practices, about how code should be structured. I think headings are also an important topic. The hierarchy of headings of the website. There are plenty of things to think about, but just designing websites that are screen reader friendly, in turn we will get websites that are friendlier and easier to interact with for everyone. So I would say accessibility, again, I think it's a recurring topic, but I think it's just like a fundamental truth in here that designing accessible websites in the end benefits everyone, and taking care of it from the start will avoid us like different maintenance costs and other extra work, other kinds of extra work in the future.
I'm just thinking about screen reader like mode. Is it possible to screen reader mode bypass the ads on the website?
Actually, a screen reader can bypass everything on the website, and depends on how depends how we structure the website. There are like different ways to tell the screen reader in code to like omit a certain element. And also people using screen readers can customize how the screen reader interacts with a website. They can choose how they want the screen reader to interact with images of certain kinds of content. So it's not like everyone has exactly the same screen reader. Of course, there are like some common parts, but you can choose to customize how to enable the screen reader, how fast it reads, how it interacts with images, how it interacts with forms, all kinds of stuff. So I really encourage going into the accessibility part of settings, be it on MacBook, on your iPhone, on your Android phone, or Windows. Even I think Windows screen reader is called Narrator, and I think it's a pretty cool name. And just seeing what's in there, just like, looking at the list of things people can customize, it's an interesting lesson in itself.
Okay, Kalina, I think we have a really nice episode. Do you have any final word to wrap up every single topic we just covered?
I think I have a suggestion or something maybe to try in your everyday life, really, is to look at people in public transport, people you see on the street, people that are different from you in many ways when it comes to age, when it comes to the kind of devices they use, and look at how they use technology, how they interact in a different way, what are the limitations, what they struggle with. I think it's a very important lesson when it comes to understanding why accessibility is important to have a very, very large group of people. So I think this is the final remark I have.
So at the end, it's just a human-to-human interaction.
Yes, it's just empathy. That's all.
Okay, Kalina, thank you so much for this episode. Can you just remind us where we can find you online?
Right, I think LinkedIn is probably the best place and the most up-to-date place for my professional activities.
Okay. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you maybe one time in Warsaw, maybe to meet with us in our office, to record some another episodes of a podcast, but also to drink some little coffee, from the picture of behind you.
Sounds like a plan, definitely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Dziękujemy za wysłuchanie tego odcinka podcastu Smart City Navigators. Mamy nadzieję, że spodobała Ci się dzisiejsza audycja. Podziel się swoimi przemyśleniami w komentarzach i nie zapomnij zasubskrybować tego kanału, aby nie przegapić nowego odcinka. Widzimy się i słyszymy już niebawem.